of F. Scott. Okay, welcome to the special meeting of F. Scott Fitzgerald Society of Japan and the special lecture F. Scott Fitzgerald and St. Paul. I'm Natsuchi, today's MC. Now, again, it is a great honor for us to have Mr. Stuart Wilson as today's speaker. He has kindly sent me a brief biography of himself, so I'd like to read it aloud. Stuart Wilson was the founder and former president of Fitzgerald in St. Paul, a non-profit organization celebrating the life and work of F. Scott Fitzgerald in his hometown. Stuart has presented on various Fitzgerald topics nationally and locally, and he spearheaded the publication of F. Scott Fitzgerald in Minnesota, written by Dave Page. He and his partner Melissa Bucker co-chaired the 2017 F. Scott Fitzgerald Society Conference in St. Paul. Of course, some of us who were there are still very grateful for their great hospitality. Stu and Melissa have recently retired and moved to western Montana to be close to the grandchildren and pursuing research on Fitzgerald's visit to Montana in 1915, which influenced his famous short story, The Diamond as Big as the Ritz. Outside of his interest in Fitzgerald, Stuart Wilson is a National Library consultant working in the areas of strategic planning and fundraising. Previously, Stuart was an executive of both Minneapolis and St. Paul Public Library Foundations. He has presented and published widely on libraries and received numerous awards for his library work. He holds undergraduate and graduate degrees in history and art history from the University of Wisconsin and the University of Oregon. So, Mr. Wilson, would you start, please?
Great, thank you so much. Thank you to both Kentaro and Natsuo. It's really a pleasure to be with you all today. And indeed, it's my honor to be with you. I'm so pleased to be asked and to be able to share some of my knowledge about Fitzgerald's hometown today. I do want to also say, as I go through my presentation, I have some slides where I will stop and ask if you have any questions, but please throughout also feel free to add any questions to the chat. I actually appreciate and welcome questions. I want to make sure that I'm being understood, and even for some St. Paulites, there's some aspects of what I will talk about today that are not well understood. So, and I've learned that sometimes Americans are not very good about their own history. So please do not feel shy about asking any questions as I go through the presentation. With that, I'll start sharing my screen. And again, as I said, I will stop at various points and see if anyone has any questions. So I'll be talking today about Fitzgerald's hometown and really the local context of St. Paul during Fitzgerald's youth. F. Scott Fitzgerald was born, of course, as most of you probably know, and I know many of you have visited St. Paul, in 1896. He left St. Paul in 1924, never to return. So we're really looking at that period in the 1890s, the teens and the early 20s, when Fitzgerald really had a very close association to St. Paul. Here we see on the left, just as an opening slide, I'm sure many of you have seen this, the earliest known picture of F. Scott Fitzgerald in front of his birthplace at 481 Laurel in St. Paul. And we're not entirely sure, but we think this figure next to him is probably his mother, who was probably about a year old here. Let me talk a little bit about what I hope to accomplish today and what I hope help you understand. And that really is garnering a deeper understanding of St. Paul during Fitzgerald's youth. What was the place he grew up in? What was it really like? And then further than that, what was the social, economic, and cultural milieu, atmosphere of where Fitzgerald grew up? And then finally, a little bit about how this social environment of St. Paul influenced Fitzgerald's work. I think many of you who visited St. Paul know that the neighborhood he grew up in is very Fitzgeraldian, and there are many of his works that come directly from Fitzgerald St. Paul experience. The Ice Palace short story. There were ice palaces in St. Paul, so he was writing about real experiences. The State Fair is another example. There are other stories like the Camel's Back was based on an actual party that Fitzgerald attended where a person was wearing a camel. Today, however, I'm going to be largely talking about the milieu, not direct causal links of this happened and then Fitzgerald put it in a story, but more the atmosphere, the values, the underlying context of St. Paul, and how that influenced, I believe, influenced Fitzgerald's work. So the areas I'm going to try and examine today are first and foremost the Irish Catholic background of the Fitzgeralds and the Irish Catholic background of St. Paul. Economic and social class were also bound up with religion and ethnicity and how that affected Fitzgerald. And then lastly, I think often is overlooked because his last name was Fitzgerald. Many scholars look at his father's line, the Fitzgerald line, but the family that was based in St. Paul was actually his mother's family. So I want to talk a little bit about his mother's influence and the influence of his mother's family, who were also Irish Catholic, and they were the McQuillets. So I will talk a little bit about that. And all three of these things are intertwining. So to preview a little bit, we will talk a little bit about St. Paul as an Irish Catholic city and how Fitzgerald fit in St. Paul, but he also didn't fit in very well when he left St. Paul. So it was both St. Paul and then when he went to the East Coast, he often didn't fit in as an Irish Catholic. Trade and economics and how the Irish Catholic community fit into the trade and economics of St. Paul. Catholic values, I'll touch a little bit on his mother's Catholic values and what that meant for Fitzgerald and how we can see that in many of his works, including his masterwork, The Great Gatsby. I think it's really useful to look at two of the really prominent iconic figures of St. Paul, James J. Hill, the great railroad baron, and Archbishop John Ireland, and how they really typified the period and really were important to Fitzgerald as community leaders. And then I want to end with a little period from 1916 to 1918, when really the social order in St. Paul changed. The social order in the world changed in that period, but in St. Paul, it also changed very dramatically in leadership, and the basis of class and religion and ethnicity also changed in those 3 years. When Fitzgerald was just beginning his writing career, he was 20 to 22. So those are the big areas I hope to touch on today. I want to start with St. Paul history. And to understand St. Paul history, you need to understand a little bit about American history. St. Paul was typical as a city in the Midwest and the middle part of the country, but in many ways it was atypical. It wasn't the usual. There's some unusual aspects of St. Paul, and I want to highlight some of those as I go through the presentation. I think it's important to understand that St. Paul was a new city. It was there were still many people who had settled, Europeans who had settled St. Paul, who were still alive when Fitzgerald was born. It was only about 50 years old. You know, and in a European or a Japanese context, a city that's only 50 years old is brand new, but that's where Fitzgerald was born. It was really born out of wilderness. I think it's important to understand then that for Americans outside of the East Coast, cities like St. Paul were cities of immigrants. They were brand new people coming to the United States, and understanding why they were coming and who they were in Europe, particularly in Europe, really shaped the cities and the atmosphere. And that was very true of St. Paul. And then lastly, I think this goes to the idea of trade and economics. The vast resources in America that were available when these cities were built meant that it was an enormous land of opportunity. People who struggled in Europe all of a sudden were in places in America where within a generation they could become fabulously wealthy. And so the context of Europe versus America in terms of being a place of opportunity, I think feeds very much into Fitzgerald's being the great American author talking about class and the American dream. The American dream was what these immigrants came to the United States for and came to St. Paul for. So I love this image of St. Paul. It's from 1853. St. Paul had only begun to be settled within 8 years prior to this, and already you see substantial establishments along the bluffs in St. Paul. You see riverboats coming up and down the Mississippi. Many Americans, I've run into many Americans who don't understand that St. Paul is actually on the Mississippi. It is, even though it's thousands of kilometers from the oceans, it is the last port on the Mississippi, which means that goods could travel all the way down the Mississippi and get anywhere in the world. So St. Paul was an important place because of its role on the Mississippi River, being able to be navigable. On the right-hand side, I think it's covered on my screen, you also see a depiction of Native Americans, the Dakota Sioux, who of course were the natives of Minnesota. And they were still resident and quite prominent in the area when St. Paul was first established. So this is a major, St. Paul was a major place for Native Americans, the Dakota Sioux, to come together. And so you see that St. Paul is still a wilderness, really only one generation from when F. Scott Fitzgerald was born in St. Paul. So I want to start by talking about St. Paul is very much a Catholic city. As I said, it was founded in the late 1840s, really began to grow in the 1850s. It was first founded and settled by French Catholic missionaries. So the early basis in St. Paul was French, but very quickly the Irish immigrated to St. Paul and they took over the leadership of the city, and they were all Catholic for the most part, took over the leadership of both the Catholic Church and the city by the 1860s. And so you see this Catholic base in St. Paul. St. Paul is named after a Catholic saint. And you see this shift from French immigration to Irish immigration almost immediately in the founding of St. Paul. And the Catholic Church is central to that. Here in this picture, which is from 1857, again, St. Paul's only about 10 years old, you see the building of the first cathedral. The cathedral, if you don't know, is the seat of the bishop. So the bishop controls not only his own parish, but all of the other churches in a region. So St. Paul, only 10 years old, was already the center of Catholic religion for the entire state of Minnesota. And they were building a very prominent church, only 10 years when St. Paul was 10 years old. So as part of this, we need to also look at the ethnic mix of who was in St. Paul, and particularly by the time F. Scott Fitzgerald was born. I think it's fascinating to see that the largest group that settled in St. Paul were actually Germans. So it's a very large group. They too were largely Catholic, but they were business owners. They were petty bourgeoisie who came over and established businesses very quickly. They had left German territories, primarily for political reasons. So they were escaping political conflicts in Germany, and so had some wealth to begin with when they settled in St. Paul. The Germans, when they settled in St. Paul, and this is true still in Fitzgerald's day, were very focused on their own heritage. They wanted to maintain German language, German customs. The businesses that they created were very German-oriented. The most prominent businesses they created were breweries, so beer, and they were selling to the German community. Other businesses they started were notably bakeries and butcher shops, processing of meat. So second largest class were Swedes, Swedish community that came over, Scandinavians. The Scandinavians were mainly Lutheran, so they were not Catholic. They were largely working class, and both the Swedes and the Irish came because of famines and food shortages in their countries. So they were quite poor when they came to the United States for the most part. But they found a land of opportunity. The Swedes, like the Germans, maintained their own cultural heritage. They wanted to continue speaking Swedish. They wanted to focus on Swedish culture. They didn't embrace being Americans right away. The Swedes were largely working class. Sprinkled through Fitzgerald's work, you periodically see him referencing Swedish servants working in the houses of wealthy people. That's because the Swedes were kind of the servant working class in St. Paul. The third largest group, of which the Fitzgeralds and the Quillans were included, were the Irish, and they were Catholic as well. They were probably largely working class, but there were also some people of wealth who came and established in St. Paul. So they were more mixed classes. One of the things that made the Irish very unique is they were focused on Americanization. They said, we're going to be Americans, we're going to give up our Irish heritage, this is a new land, we're never going back to Ireland. We're going to make our life here and get integrated into this new land that we're in. So unlike the other groups, they really focused on being Americans and modernizing. And part of that was because of all of these groups, they were the only group that were English speaking. And that was a critical factor for the Irish in connecting in America. And the last group were the Italians, and they too were Catholic, tended to be lower class or involved in craft. St. Paul had a large shoe industry, and many of the shoemakers were actually Italian. And like the Germans and Swedes, they were very focused on their own Italian heritage and continuing to speak Italian rather than English. So you see, there were some other representative groups, but these were the four big groups that made up the mix of St. Paul. And you can see that many of these groups really were maintaining their own language and culture at the time. So as part of this story, and I think those of you who have been to St. Paul understand, it's really St. Paul and Minneapolis. It's twin cities. They're two cities that are very close together. They're only 10 kilometers apart on the Mississippi River. St. Paul is the last port, and Minneapolis had a major falls and rapids so that you couldn't actually navigate to Minneapolis. But it was built on power. There was great electricity that could be generated in the Mississippi in Minneapolis. So Minneapolis grew up as an industrial city. These two cities together, today they're about 3 million people, became a significant national and regional center by the time of Fitzgerald's birth. And I'll talk a little bit about that when I talk about trade and commerce. So these two cities contrast, even though they're very close together. And if you visit today, it's hard for visitors to even say they're two separate cities, but they still are two separate cities today. St. Paul was dominated by the Catholics. Minneapolis was dominated by Lutherans, particularly German Lutherans and Scandinavian Lutherans. St. Paul was Irish controlled. The major forces in Minneapolis were people from the East Coast who came in and bought into financing the new industries in Minneapolis. So it was really controlled by East Coast Protestants. So in many cases, these were people who were just interested in investment in Minneapolis and were not really people in Minneapolis per se. St. Paul was the older city. It tended to be more conservative. Minneapolis was newer, more bustling. Some of these things still hold today. St. Paul is still more conservative. Minneapolis is more innovative and bustling. The big one, I think, for the Irish Catholics and for Fitzgerald and to understand is that St. Paul's economy was based on trade. It was a trading city. It wasn't particularly an industrial city. Minneapolis, on the other hand, was based on industry. The two major industries in Minneapolis early on was lumber and wood production. And then later on, it was wheat production. Minneapolis became the largest producer of wheat and flour in the world. It really became the milling center for all of the wheat that was grown in the Great Plains in the United States. So these two cities were very different. And because St. Paul was a trading city, there was much more mixing of people and classes and ethnicity. In Minneapolis, there were deeper social divides between the very wealthy people and the people who were working class. This is also important to understand because Fitzgerald certainly understood this and knew this as part of being a St. Paulite. Minneapolis first surpasses St. Paul as the leading city around 1900. And so you see that St. Paul begins to feel inferior to Minneapolis. Still has an inferiority complex today. St. Paulites today still get upset that Minneapolis always comes first. It's always Minneapolis, St. Paul, not St. Paul, Minneapolis. And so you see, to some degree for Fitzgerald, some of this tension about feeling a little inferior or being an outsider also came from being in what now became the second city in the place that he grew up. So I want to talk a little bit about St. Paul as a trading city, and this was recognized by another great American author, Mark Twain, early on by the 1880s. St. Paul was really built initially on ox cart trades. I'll show you a map in a minute. St. Paul actually there were trading routes up into Canada and Winnipeg, for those of you who know Canada, for the fur trade. And these were furs that were sent back to the East Coast in Europe. Later on, as you see in this depiction from, I think it's 1867, the Mississippi meant that St. Paul became a major trading center. It's a place where goods came in and then were transported to Eastern markets, to places like New York and Boston through the Mississippi. So the Mississippi was really St. Paul's lifeblood. And many of the buildings that were built in St. Paul were warehousing buildings to hold goods until they could be transported down the Mississippi. And then finally, beginning in the 1880s, late 1870s and 1880s, St. Paul became a major railroad center, probably the second largest railroad center after Chicago in the Midwest. And became a giant in the railroad industry. So you see, from ox carts to railroads, St. Paul became this, the lifeblood was trade and commerce and moving goods and connections to the entire world and to the East Coast. And that's the milieu that Fitzgerald grew up in. As part of this, there also had to be a civic compact. And what I mean by that is everyone in St. Paul had to communicate and interact with one another as part of trade. Unlike the industries in Minneapolis, where people worked in a factory and then there were upper class that controlled the finances. In St. Paul, the people who controlled the finances also had to interact with all the people who were managing the trade all day long. So there was much greater mixing and a sort of civic understanding that everyone was in it together in St. Paul, unlike Minneapolis. And that's true for most of the other big cities in the Midwest in the United States. Most of the other big cities like Detroit or Chicago were industrial cities, and St. Paul was not. St. Paul was a trading city. So here, just wanted to give you a little sense of, for those of you who haven't been to the United States, but also give you a sense of what was happening with St. Paul. Over here on the right is Baltimore, little diamond shaped. That's where Fitzgerald's father was from. Minneapolis, St. Paul here is here, and then of course down the Mississippi to New Orleans, goods could be shipped that way. Another important connection is St. Paul was very connected to Duluth, which is only about 2 hours north. And Duluth, Minnesota is the last port, the final port, final port on the Great Lakes system. So Minneapolis, St. Paul are about 2,000 kilometers from the east, but in the interior of this vast continent, Minnesota was the place where goods could be shipped to eastern markets, to the big eastern markets, either through Duluth and the Great Lakes or down the Mississippi. And so also wanted to reference here, Winnipeg is where the initial trade was out of St. Paul. That's where the ox carts went and trade up the rivers. Later on, it was the Mississippi and then the Great Lakes, and then finally the railroad centers. St. Paul had massive number of trains that ran daily to Chicago, which was the great railroad center of the United States. And then there also was a major railway line, which I'll show you in a little bit here, the Great Northern Railway that ran all the way across the United States to the west. And that railway line really helped create the city of Seattle, for instance. And so this was about moving products from this vast territory to eastern markets. So the Dakotas, North and South Dakota, were major wheat production. And that wheat was shipped to Minneapolis on the railroads and then milled and then shipped east. Northern Minnesota was the Iron Range, where most of the iron that built the steel industries of America was mined in northern Minnesota. And that was shipped east out of Duluth and St. Paul. Montana was the place where copper came from and it really electrified America. And that was shipped all through St. Paul. And then vast timber territory in Washington and Oregon that really built the houses of America was shipped across the Great Northern Railway to St. Paul and then to markets east. So you see St. Paul is this really center of trade for a vast region of the United States. So I want to return a little bit here to the notion of why did Irish Catholics dominate St. Paul? And they were only the third largest group. You would expect the Germans to dominate because they were the largest group. But the Irish were really the glue that held that trade together. They could communicate with everyone. They naturally connected to Germans and Italians because their Catholicism connected them. That was very important. They saw each other in the cathedral and in their parishes. The Irish, in many cases, were the traders because they were the ones who were fluent in English, the language of trade, and they were the most fluent in English. Another important aspect here is they were connected to the great railroad baron who controlled the railroad that ran across to Seattle, James J. Hill. Hill was not Catholic, but his wife was a devout Catholic. And so the connection in St. Paul to Catholicism in this prominent leader was through his wife. And that was very true. And have more to say about Hill in a little bit here. And so you see by 1860 and by the time F. Scott Fitzgerald was born, the Irish had entered the top rungs of all the positions in the city and the Catholic Church and really had come to dominate St. Paul and were a major figure across Minnesota. And that's pretty unusual in the American context, that the Irish were so dominant in a city. There are not many cities in America where that was true. The picture you see here is the actual church, parish church where the Fitzgeralds worshiped. This no longer exists, it was torn down. The Catholic churches in St. Paul all were based on ethnicity. So the Germans had separate churches, the Irish had separate churches. This was an Irish parish, and that's where the Fitzgeralds worship. So I want to stop a little bit. That was a lot to cover and see if you have any questions, details, if you're understanding everything, anything you want to know more about, and happy to take any questions at this point rather than waiting until the end.
Actually, yes.
Yeah.
You have just mentioned that St. Paul was really Catholic orientated city. And can you think of any other city where Catholic is as dominant as St. Paul?
Well, the city that's probably closest is Boston.
Mm-hmm.
Boston is a very Catholic city, and it's a very Irish Catholic city. I think what distinguishes it from St. Paul is the British European wealth that controlled Boston was not Irish or Catholic. It was old European settlement from the 1630s, mm-hmm. and in many cases also connected to Harvard. And so you see Boston as an Irish Catholic city, but it's not controlled by the Irish Catholics the way St. Paul was. There's some elements in New York City and Chicago that are also strong Irish Catholic, mm-hmm. but again, they tended to not control the city. In some cases they became famous because they controlled the police forces, mm-hmm. but not so much the mayor or the civic life of the city, the way that happened in St. Paul.
Thank you very much.
Pretty unique that way.
Awesome.
Any other questions? Anything else I can help with? Not, we can go back to sharing. And
sorry, I can ask one more?
Of course.
Yes, you mentioned the fur trade in St. Paul. And what kind of fur did they trade most?
Well, the most prominent fur trade across America were in beaver furs. Beaver. Mm-hmm. And this was going back to both the East Coast and Europe, where making beaver hats, the top hats, mm-hmm. were made out of beaver skins. Mm-hmm. And so beaver, during the first settlement wave, there were large numbers of beaver in northern Minnesota and then up into Canada and Winnipeg in the Lake Territories. There. So there were other furs that were traded, but beaver was where the wealth was.
Thank you.
Yep. Anyone else? More chances for questions later, so just feel free to ask. Well, I want to turn to the Fitzgeralds themselves and how this, what I just talked about, connected to the Fitzgerald. Here we see pictures of Scott with his father, Edward Fitzgerald, and then with his mother, Molly McQuillan Fitzgerald, both as a young boy. So Fitzgerald's heritage. Both sides of his family were Irish and Catholic. Both sides, Fitzgerald was second generation, which means his parents or grandparents had come to America. They were new immigrants. The person who I think was most important in terms of his Irish Catholic heritage was his mother's father, his maternal grandfather, Philip McQuillan, who you see pictured here. Philip settled in St. Paul very early on in 1857. St. Paul was only about 10 years old. He built an extremely successful warehousing business, again, based on trade. And it was in groceries, food products that he would store before they were shipped to markets. He became very prominent and wealthy, and that wealth continued into Fitzgerald's generation. So his Philip McQuillan died in the 1870s, so he didn't know his grandson Scott. But his wife Louisa lived until I think 1903, into the 19-teens. And when she died, she left a significant estate to Scott Scott's parents. It was valued at $3 million in 1915, I believe. So the Fitzgeralds were actually quite wealthy and quite prominent in St. Paul. Despite what Fitzgerald always talked about being a poor boy, he did not come from a poor family. His mother's family was quite wealthy. I'll talk a little bit later about how they were wealthy, but he was also part of a St. Paul that had extreme wealth. So sometimes he felt poor because he was socializing with people and families who were extremely wealthy. And the Fitzgerald family was just normal wealthy, if that makes any sense. So Scott's father was always also Irish Catholic, but from an older family and from the East Coast, from Maryland. And he had no connections in St. Paul. So you see all the power of the Fitzgerald family, Scott's family, came from his mother's side and from his grandfather's legacy of building this business. So this is a quote from F. Scott Fitzgerald: "I'm half Black Irish and half Old American, with the usual exaggerated ancestral pretensions." The half Old American, I think, is referring to his father's side. It was from the East Coast. It was more established. They had pretensions towards having a longer heritage in the United States. The half Black Irish, there are many different nuanced meanings to being Black Irish. The simplest one being that you have black hair. Stereotype Irish people have red hair. But I think here Fitzgerald is recognizing that his Irishness outside of St. Paul was a liability. It was a negative. Many places in the United States viewed Irish very negatively. So being Black Irish was not a positive thing for Fitzgerald. Having old roots was positive, being Irish was not positive. So in his works and the way he talked, he references his Catholic side regularly. There are even some stories like absolution and benediction that are really Catholic stories. They are come out of the worship services of being Catholic. And he's very directly referencing his Catholicism. Rarely does he reference his Irishness. And part of this was there was very significant discrimination against both Irish and Catholic in the United States well into the 20th century. For instance, we think of the Ku Klux Klan, the group that is anti-Black in the United States, was also rabidly anti-Catholic. And part of this fear was that Catholics would come to power and that then Rome, the Pope, would dominate American society. Some of it was old prejudice from Britain, the Catholic Protestant difficulties. And then again, the old settlement from Britain also meant Irish were very frowned upon. So this discrimination was very deep across the United States. So you see for Fitzgerald, when he left St. Paul, he ran into discrimination and negativity because he was Irish Catholic that he never ran into in St. Paul. So St. Paul was a special place for him in that way. And I think also allowed him to grow up more comfortably than he might have in a Boston or a New York as an Irish Catholic. Another important part of this is his mother's side. And here we see Molly with both Scott and his sister Annabelle. Fitzgerald's mother was a devout Catholic. And in particular, she was connected to a school for girls called Visitation, which also had a convent with nuns. Fitzgerald's grandfather, Philip McQuillan, had actually helped start this school. He financed it. And then the whole female line of the Fitzgeralds attended this school. Fitzgerald did not attend a Catholic school, but all of the female members of his family attended Visitation School and were highly trained by the nuns of the Visitation School. There were some deep values that came out of Visitation School, and they were based on the French founder of the religious order. And one was that education and the arts were highly valued. There are stories of Scott going to Visitation with his mother and telling stories to the nuns and writing things for the nuns at Visitation. And both writing and the arts and education for women were a highly valued part of the schooling that went on there. Another aspect was Visitation very much focused on instilling that Catholicism was to help people in need. It was a very socially aware, value-based kind of religion that you You got ahead in your religion if you helped other people. And another aspect of that were principles of practicality, of having your home be well ordered, domestic tranquility. And so I think you see all of these traits in Fitzgerald's mother, and many of them were passed on to Scott. These values that came from the female line, that came from the Catholic order of visitation. And so what did all this mean for Scott? So I think we've touched on this already, and as Natsuo asked about, there was a relative ease and comfort of being Irish and Catholic in St. Paul. There was not really discrimination. You could traverse, you could be in the highest rungs of society, you could get the best education available. There was no discrimination against you. When Fitzgerald went to Princeton, all of a sudden it was clear that he was not going to get in the best societies. He was not going to be allowed to get into the best societies. When he met up with other wealthy people and were interested in their daughters, they weren't Irish Catholic, and he was always going to be the outsider. So St. Paul was a place of comfort. When he left St. Paul, his Irish Catholicism almost immediately made him an outsider. And this is reflected also in that the prominent civic leaders of St. Paul were both Irish and Catholic, or had Irish Catholic works. So these values, this comfort of being Irish and Catholic, underlies many of Fitzgerald's work. I think even in The Great Gatsby, Nick Carraway is an outsider viewing Eastern culture and viewing wealth. But I think you also see one of the things of American society, I think any society, is as a young man, Fitzgerald rebelled against many of these things. So an example of that is Zelda is almost the opposite of Fitzgerald's mother. So once Fitzgerald became a young man, he rebelled against his Catholicism. He rebelled against the domestic practicality of his mother and chose Zelda as his wife because she was wild and wasn't really a homemaker. So you see in Fitzgerald this tension between the values that he learned in St. Paul and that came from his mother, and then also rejecting them as a young man and as a young writer. And I think that both of those are important to understand around Fitzgerald. So I want to discuss, as an example of this, two of St. Paul's early leaders. This is a picture of downtown St. Paul in 1908. This is the year that the Fitzgeralds returned from Buffalo, New York, after Fitzgerald's father failed in business in Buffalo. You can see this is St. Paul's 50 years old. Already it has 6-story buildings. It has a streetcar line. People are buying cars. It's a very prominent, wealthy place in only 50 years. This is really, many of the people on the street that you would see here might have been alive when St. Paul was in its earliest settlement days. So a major change in a very short period of time. The two individuals, if you can point to two individuals who made this happen, were John Ireland, the Bishop and Archbishop of St. Paul, the Catholic Archbishop of St. Paul, and James J. Hill, the great railroad baron. So John Ireland, his name was Ireland, and he was Irish, was born in Ireland in 1838 and was one of the earliest settlers to St. Paul. He was probably the most educated, highly educated person in the entire state of Minnesota. He had been sent back to France to be educated by the Catholic Church. And he came back and was ordained as a priest, and really was an intellectual Catholic. There are many strains of Catholicism, and Archbishop Ireland was a very intellectual, educated orientation towards Catholicism, not as emotional or ecstatic as some other aspects of Catholicism. He was a strong believer in Americanization of immigrants. He managed to actually bring many Irish people over to Minnesota and the Midwest, and he really encouraged them to enter into American society and become new Americans. So the ethos that he preached, particularly to Irish Catholics, was to become Americans, become integrated, become part of this new society. And as a part of that, he also saw America as the land of opportunity in modernization. So he pushed being a modern country, and he really became one of the leaders in the Catholic Church, made regular visits back to Rome and to visit with the Pope. He really was this intellectual giant. And for the Fitzgeralds, his home was at the cathedral, which was 2 blocks away from where the Fitzgeralds lived. His mother interacted regularly with Archbishop John Ireland. I have no proof, but I think Ireland may have been behind the choice of where Fitzgerald went to boarding school and high school, the Newman School in New Jersey, which was also an Irish Catholic intellectual center. So Ireland was a giant in St. Paul and controlled much of Minnesota and the region because of its Catholicism, but also was an intellectual force for the Fitzgeralds in the region. The other person is James J. Hill, who is known as the Empire Building. He was an early St. Paul settler. He was a contemporary of Fitzgerald's father and a friend of Philip's grandfather, He was a friend of Philip McQuillan. The Fitzgeralds maintain a close connection to the Hill family throughout their life. Fitzgerald's sister Annabelle, for instance, was in the wedding of one of Hill's daughters. Fitzgerald's mother was close friends with Hill's wife, Mary. Hill grew and became one of the wealthiest men in America. I looked up before this presentation, and I think by 1900, he was the 12th wealthiest person in the United States. And the people who were ahead of him were like the Rockefellers and Morgans, giants in finance. He amassed this huge wealth because of the Great Northern Railroad and really was at the center of this St. Paul trading empire. And again, he's one of the individuals. Fitzgerald always spoke very positively about Hill. He references him in The Great Gatsby. Hill is someone who built a great business. He wasn't just in it for investment or building wealth. He really wanted to build a great business. And so Fitzgerald looked up to him. At the same time, Hill was one of those people who, unlike the Fitzgeralds who were wealthy, Hill had fantastic wealth. He was extremely wealthy. So in the Fitzgerald social context, the Fitzgeralds were not wealthy compared to the Hills. Compared to most people who lived in St. Paul, the Fitzgeralds were very wealthy. Again, Hill was not Catholic himself, but he supported most of the Catholic institutions in St. Paul, and his wife was very involved with Archbishop Ireland. Hill and then his son subsequently dominated St. Paul, literally the cultural, social, economic life of St. Paul for decades, and still have influence today. Just to reference again connections, the Camel's Back story is actually based on a party that was held in Louis Hill, James J. Hill's house. So you can see that Fitzgerald was very connected with the Hills. Tell you a little bit more about Hill. This is the railroad line that ran here. You can see Minneapolis-St. Paul. It connected to Duluth, to the Great Lakes. It connected to Chicago. And then really this was the major railroad line that ran all the way to Seattle. And again, it was pulling wheat in from the Dakotas, copper and silver from Montana, and the great lumber resources in Washington, Oregon, and all being shipped east. So you can imagine why he was incredibly wealthy, because his wealth was based on these tremendous natural resources. To give you a further sense of how the Fitzgeralds were connected, this is a map of those of you who've been to St. Paul know that this neighborhood, the Fitzgerald neighborhood, is quite small, and you can walk this entire neighborhood within 15 minutes. All of these places are very closely connected. All of the green dots are places where F. Scott and his family lived or family members lived. The gray dots are where Fitzgerald's close friends lived. The red dots here, the big one is James J. Hill's mansion. The small one right next door is his son's mansion. And then the cathedral is right here, just off the map. And so this is all very closely connected. It was all part of the social atmosphere that the Fitzgerald family was part of, and particularly his mother's family. So 2 dots to reference in particular. This green dot is Fitzgerald's great uncle, John Allen, his grandmother's brother. And John Allen ran the business that Philip
フリーズしてますね。
そうですね。
いや、待ちましょうね。
気がついてないかも。
ちょっと送ってみましょうか。チャット。
Quillen created.
あ、戻りましたね。
また戻って見えると思いますので、少し、待って、大丈夫ですね。また戻られました。
Am I back? Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm back.
Sorry about that. I think it might have been on my end.
No problem.
So I'm not sure where you lost me.
Page.
Did you hear about, did you see this slide?
Yes.
And this
Yeah.
one I was talking about? Did you
Yes.
get the context of this?
Mm-hmm.
So just to finish, this was Fitzgerald's great uncle's house, very wealthy man. For St. Paul, Minnesota, Americans, this is an important blue dot. This is the house of Frederick Weyerhaeuser, a German Catholic who really controlled the timber industry and still is the largest timber, lumber, wood products company in the United States. So it's Frederick Weyerhaeuser. So this whole line of houses is very wealthy people, and one of Fitzgerald's close relatives was part of that line. So for those of you who haven't been to St. Paul, this is the Cathedral of St. Paul, which dominates the skyline of St. Paul. And right across the street is Fitzgerald or James J. Hill's mansion. And the mansion is still the largest private residence in Minnesota. It's an enormous structure, a museum today, but really a very large, expensive structure and these two are very closely connected. So these two figures in St. Paul, both of whom were strongly connected to the Fitzgerald family, really grew St. Paul into national prominence. And they both got their start when St. Paul was new. They were both self-made men. They created something out of nothing, if you will. It's important to note that Hill supported these Catholic institutions, and the Catholic institutions also supported Hill's idea of business. He wanted workers that would work hard, would minimize social unrest, would not make any waves. And that's the kind of Catholicism that Ireland preached. So there was a compact between Archbishop Ireland and James J. Hill as kind of business, religious Irish leaders. So James J. Hill died in 1916. John Ireland died in 1918. And a major change, a major social cultural change with the addition of the railway strike, which I'm going to talk about, really changed the whole structure of St. Paul. It paralleled major things that were happening in the world. the end of World War I, the Russian Revolution. But these things were happening in Fitzgerald's hometown as well. So I think when you look at Fitzgerald as a young socialist and talking about stories like May Day, or even the social construct that's in The Great Gatsby, talking about wealth and the American dream, you're seeing this come out of some of the atmosphere of St. Paul that he grew up in. So before I go to my last question, my last section, any questions at this point? Does the context of Hill and Archbishop Ireland make sense? Does this Catholic values influencing Fitzgerald resonate for you? Or many of you know Fitzgerald's work strongly, and I think these influences were very powerful in Fitzgerald's work, at least through the Great Gatsby and his work in the 20s. It kind of fades the older he gets. So any questions, anything you want to know at this point?
I have one question.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. As you have suggested, probably Fitzgerald chose Newman School. And he went to Newman School in 1911 or somewhere in 1911. And I would like to know the relationship between Archbishop Ireland and the Newman School people, especially Father Fay and so on.
Right. You know, I haven't documented a direct connection there, but Ireland was the leader of the Irish Catholic community across the United States. In the Newman School, I know Monsignor Fay, who ran the Newman School, who was a good friend of Fitzgerald's and mentor to Fitzgerald, was also trained in some of the same schools where Ireland was. So I don't have definitive proof that Ireland was this connection, but it's logical that there was a connection there, that Ireland would know about Monsignor Fay and the Newman School. And then the further connection to Irish writers like Shane Leslie, who Monsignor Fay connected Fitzgerald to. So there was almost this Irish Catholic educational intellectual line that John Ireland was the leader of in the United States. The other bishops in the United States were not Irish. They were of different faiths or of different heritage. And so Ireland really was positioned as the leader of the Irish church in the United States. And I think there were only 5 bishops in the United States at the time. So the leadership of the Catholic Church was a very small number of people, and Ireland was at the top rung of that. So no proof, but strong suspicion.
Yeah, thank you very much. I also hear that there are not enough proof around on the topic, so I can understand. But at any rate, probably Catholic people around Fitzgerald or modernist or somewhere, American group or something like that.
Yeah, you know, I'm not sure. But another connection, which I've never been able to prove, is Fitzgerald's grandmother, Louisa, I think also was very strongly connected to Ireland. And Louisa or his aunt Annabelle put up the money for Fitzgerald to go to both Newman School and Princeton. And so the wealth that sent Fitzgerald east, both for boarding school and for Princeton, came from his mother's line, and those 2 women were particularly attached to John Ireland. So that's another one where there's no proof, but all the evidence points in that direction.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, it doesn't really answer your question, but
thank you.
It's strong likelihood with no proof. Anything else I can answer at this point? So I have one more short section and then really can take any questions. I recognize that place.
Sorry, I have one question. I'd like to ask about Annabella. You said Fitzgerald rejected his mother's Catholicism.
Mhm.
But how about Annabella, who went to visitation school?
Annabelle, Annabelle
Annabelle-
remained.
Annabella is very, was Annabella a very Catholic woman?
Annabelle remained a devout Catholic throughout her entire life. I think Scott and Annabelle did not remain particularly close, and Scott really did give up his Catholicism, where Annabelle really remained very devout, and she made regular visits, even though she no longer lived in St. Paul. She made regular visits back for Catholic retreats to visitation, and was very friendly with one of the nuns at visitation. So the Catholicism at visitation remained very strong and very powerful for Fitzgerald's sister, Annabelle. Really a sign of how strong that the mother's line in terms of Catholicism was in the Fitzgerald family. So yeah, very, very good point. And she was named after Fitzgerald's aunt, Molly's sister. And so Molly's sister, Annabelle, was also a very important part of Fitzgerald's life in St. Paul. His aunt was a very powerful figure. So I think in St. Paul, his aunt and his mother and his grandmother were really the people who really formed the foundations of his education and values, and those were rooted in visitation. And you see that continuing very strongly in his sister, where Scott really rejected some of that. To go on, Fitzgerald does become, I'm not sure he maintained his idealism as a socialist, but in the early 20s, he clearly had socialist values, and even I think I've seen some references where he recognized he was a socialist. And that's a line of Catholicism about helping people in need that also exists. And we see that today in Catholicism of continuing about more of a social construct and helping those most in need. And I think some of Fitzgerald's socialism comes from his Catholic values. So he gave up practicing Catholicism. I don't think he gave up the values. And the fact in his stories that he went back to Catholic stories like absolution and benediction is a demonstration of how powerful that was for him.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, great question. All of them have been great questions. Anything else? I have one more short section and then we'll take any questions about any of this. So the last section is about how the world changed from 1816 to 1818 in St. Paul. You there? Thought I saw you freeze. Okay, good. So in 1917 was the largest labor unrest in St. Paul's history. A major strike against the streetcars. And here you see in front of the St. Paul Library, the military were called out to quell the riots, to stop the riots that were happening. You see a picture of the major riots here happening, and then strikers and military around the streetcars. This combined with Hill dying, James J. Hill dying in 1916, and then Archbishop Ireland dying in 1918, meant the whole social construct that Fitzgerald had grew up in changed from his when he was 20 to 22. And he wasn't living as much in St. Paul then, but he still was very connected and coming back to St. Paul as a young man. And this is really when the formative years of him becoming a great writer, is that whole social construct in his hometown changes. So just a few details of the strike. These were some of the women who were out supporting the strike. It really was a violent strike that a number of people were killed. There really was rioting in the streets, destruction of major property. It was an early strike in the period. There had not been many strikes before. It was coming out of World War I, and it was paralleling national labor unrest and major issues like the Russian Revolution. So it wasn't divorced from national and international trends, but St. Paul was at the forefront of this happening, that this major strike was happening. Some of the overtones of this, they were striking for higher wages and better working conditions, fewer hours. But the streetcar line was also owned by Eastern influences, people from New York and Boston. And so the St. Paulites who managed the strike really were striking against these Eastern investment financiers. And they also were based in Minneapolis. So we see, even though the streetcars ran in both Minneapolis and St. Paul, the strike was in St. Paul and it had a very anti-Minneapolis flavor as well. It was really led by Irish Catholics who worked on the streetcar line, and secondarily by Swedes who worked on the streetcar line. This is an aside, probably doesn't have much to do with Fitzgerald, but those of, I'm guessing many of you are interested in at least somewhat what happens in the United States. This strike also meant the urban laborers in the Twin Cities began to align forces with the farm owners out in rural Minnesota. So the urban and rural forces began to align politically around the working classes. And so today across America, we have the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, but Minnesota doesn't have a Democratic Party. It has a Democratic Farmer Labor Party. And that's from the roots of this strike, is the farmers and laborers got together and then later on became and merged the Democratic Party. So today the legacy of this strike still lives on in Minnesota in our political structure and is unusual in the United States. So the strike was really the beginning. Here you see strikers at a rally. The strike was the beginning of a major social change for St. Paul and Irish Catholic. What had been run by Irish Catholics and Catholicism and a commitment to trade was now breaking down, and workers were aligning with other workers. So from this point on, the Irish workers are aligning more with the Swedish workers and not so much with being Irish and Catholic. And so you see a real shift of away from aligning yourselves or the social structure being based on religion and ethnicity, and instead being based on class in St. Paul. This is a major shift. So we see strong themes of class consciousness, youth and rebellion, and a new world order. And you see this in Fitzgerald coming out very strongly in his work. He was a symbol of the youth of America who wanted things done differently, who had a class consciousness, who recognized that the world of James J. Hill and Archbishop Ireland wasn't going to work for them. And so you see that in Fitzgerald's work, and you also see that Fitzgerald became a symbol for the youth of America of this new world order. And some of these roots anyway were there in his hometown. And so an example of this, I don't want to spend much time on it, is the new leader that emerges in St. Paul is a man named William Mahoney. He was one of the leaders of the strike. He was a printing pressman. He worked in the newspaper trade. He was a second generation American, Irish American, so he had not emigrated. He was born in Chicago. He created a union newspaper coming out of the strike, which became a very prominent newspaper. And he was elected mayor in the 1920s in St. Paul, and the only socialist mayor ever elected in St. Paul. So you see much more radical roots coming out of this strike, and subsequent growth in St. Paul is much more working class, much more radical, much more progressive than the old world order of James J. Hill and Archbishop Ireland. Really a social change, and I think that's much of what Fitzgerald's work is about, is work for youth, work for this new order. We have to build a world that looks differently than what our parents had built. Another just aside here is William Mahoney's legacy extends to today, there still are many Irish mayors elected in St. Paul, and they really are politically aligned with what William Mahoney was aligned. And a prominent national figure, those of you who know the 1960s in the United States, Eugene McCarthy came from St. Paul and ran for president and was the leader of the anti-war movement in the 1960s. McCarthy's whole, as an Irish Catholic, whole ethos was really the legacy of William Mahoney and the strike that happened in St. Paul in 1917. So I just want to finish with kind of reviewing that this St. Paul milieu of his mother's family, wealth, labor struggles, his Irish roots, his Catholic roots, really was an important part of his background. And you see this coming through directly in some of his short stories and works, but also underlying really his perspectives and what he wrote about, his values that come through in his works. And one of the reasons Fitzgerald is such a great writer is he does talk about values and directions for America. Great Gatsby is about the American dream, and that changed in his hometown during his lifetime. I think it's really important, and I think more research is needed on his mother's family. I think his mother's family was really very important to Fitzgerald. As a 20-year-old, Fitzgerald usually referenced his mother negatively. Happens to a lot of young men in their 20s, where they revere their father and not so much their mother. Fitzgerald rebelled against his mother, but that doesn't mean that she wasn't extremely important in setting his values and his perspectives on the world. I think she was very important. And then this labor and wealth. He was friends with, his family were friends with some of the wealthiest people in the United States, wealthiest people in the world. And he was an outsider from that, even though he was wealthy. His Irish Catholicism made him an outsider outside of St. Paul. Being from St. Paul compared to Minneapolis made him an outsider. So you see in characters like Nick Carraway, who I view as a St. Paulite, is someone who's viewing the rest of the world, but also viewing it critically as an outsider. That whole construct of Nick Carraway looking at what's going on with Gatsby in the world is really, I think, one that comes from Fitzgerald's roots in St. Paul. So I just want to thank you all, and I'm happy to stay on as long as you have questions or have any details that I can help with. We'll stop sharing so I can see you.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Wilson. So if you do have any questions or comments, please do share it with us.
Any details that weren't understandable? I worry that there might be aspects that you just didn't understand. When I present this in America or similar presentations, sometimes people don't understand, like I said, even simple things like I've traveled across America and people don't understand that St. Paul is on the Mississippi River. So there are a lot of details here that I think are important to Fitzgerald's background that may be new to you or difficult to understand. So really, any questions, I'm happy to try and help answer.
So while they're organizing the thought, can I ask one more question?
Of course.
So we can trace the image of St. Paul in Fitzgerald's many stories. So what about a Minneapolis image? Do you see any Minneapolis image in his story?
You know, I don't particularly in his stories. Very good question. What I see is in his personal life, when he comes back to St. Paul, he often will go over to Minneapolis. For instance, there's a famous story of he goes over to Minneapolis and dresses as a woman and goes into parties and really disguised as a woman as a joke on the people in Minneapolis. And so I think you see this animosity towards Minneapolis that comes across in some of his personal stories, but not so much in his writings. I think his
Yes.
writings stay much more St. Paul
I see.
based.
Thank you very
Um,
much.
Yeah.
Mhm. So any other question or comment? This is a great chance, I believe.
And if you think of something, I think you all have my email. If you've got my presentation, I'm also happy to answer questions anytime in the future if there's anything I can clarify or help you with more resources. I think some of St. Paul history is really beginning to emerge, and there's some great local historians working on
Right.
the history. So St. Paulites are beginning to understand their history, and I think it's relevant to Fitzgerald. So happy to help in the future as well.
Oh, that's very generous of you. Okay, just one more. Actually, at the beginning of this meeting, I just read aloud the biography you sent. And in that, you mentioned Fitzgerald's visit to Montana in 1915,
Mhm.
which is still effective, I mean, on the Fitzgerald's lovers. So we should be more specific about that. Tell us more.
Sure. So as you referenced, until a year ago, I lived in St. Paul and know a lot about St. Paul, but our grandchildren live here in Montana. So for the last 3 or 4 years, Melissa and I have been really investigating Fitzgerald's visit to Montana in 1915 and how that really shaped many of the aspects of his famous story, Diamond as Big as the Ritz. And so he visited Montana to a ranch with his good Princeton friend, Sape Donahoe, who was also an Irish Catholic, who was also at the Newman School. And his father, Donahoe's father, was quite wealthy. They lived in Seattle, but they had a ranch in Montana. And Fitzgerald came out with Donahoe and stayed on the ranch for a month, close to a month. And so the details, he references this in his diaries and a few other places, but we don't have a lot of details. And where he visited is quite isolated. It's a town of about 1,000 people. And we now live in a place of about 100,000 in Montana, but it's 7 hours away from us. Montana is an enormous state.
Oh.
So we're close compared to most people. But this was a very isolated place that he visited. And it's clear that the two major girls in the story were the two kind of belles of the town that he visited. There are other aspects. I think the story is based on the Diamond as Big as the Ritz. There was a gold mine here that I think was the inspiration. So it wasn't a diamond mine, but a gold mine. It was an inspiration. So I think our hope next summer is to do a lot more research and detail into the newspapers and local history here in Montana and try and figure out exactly what happened to him here and more specifically what the exact inspirations were in the story. The story itself is an allegory and quite fantastical, but there are many, many details that fit the actual place he visited with his Princeton friend. So, and I don't think that's been well researched. I know that's not been well researched. We're a long ways away from anybody here in Montana.
Actually, I'm just reading the very first sentence of The Diamond as Big as the Ritz, and John T. Anger came from a family that had been well known in Hades, a small town on the Mississippi River, for several generations. Do you have an idea what the model of this Hades is?
Not clear. Dave Page thinks that there was a place that Fitzgerald, the Fitzgerald family visited on the Mississippi River in Minnesota that seems to fit some of the description of Hades. But I think that's a little looser than some of the inspirations in Montana for the story. So it's not exactly clear. The story is, as I'm sure many of you know, really a critique of wealth. It's a critique of really the Civil War, Reconstruction, slavery. And then he also has many references like Hades to religion. I think it's a critique.
Yes.
It's one of his early stories that's also a critique of religion and maybe even his Catholicism. So it can be read at one level, but the allegorical level takes it to another level of what he's critiquing in American society. And it's fascinating that that's in Montana. There's one visit created that. So for me anyway.
Mhm. Okay, thank you very much. Any comment or any question? I'm afraid that we are running out of time. So thank you again, Mr. Stewart, Mr. Wilson, and we are much obliged. And thank you for joining us. So Professor Sugino, would you please close the meeting?
Thank you very much for us, for you all. Yeah, thank you. I think we could deepen our understanding of Scott Fitzgerald and St. Paul, and probably we shared love for him. Thank you very much. Thank you. See you at the next international conference.
You are all welcome to visit in Montana. We live right by Glacier.
Yeah.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah,
it's spectacular terrain. It's very rural, but it's spectacular. So do look me up if you can make it to Montana. So,
Thank you.
thanks again.
Thank you
Bye-bye.
very much.
Bye. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank